Granting us this interview. And your name is Charles Linck.
Right.
Thank you, sir. My name is Glenn.
L-I-N-C-K. C-K, because that's German.
Oh, I see.
L-I-N-K is British.
I didn't know that.
Well, everyone should, because I really do like to have that C in there.
I didn't know, did I? Well, my name is Glenn Gaynor, and I'm doing this interview on behalf of Texas A&M University, Commerce, Texas. And today is Wednesday, the 25th of April, '07. And we're doing this on the campus in the Special Collections Department of the Guinea Library. And I want to thank you, and the school wants to thank you for the service that you did in World War II and the freedom that you and all the other men achieved. That freedom is still living today. People are still enjoying it today, and it's greatly abused, but it's still a lasting thing that you gentlemen did. And so we're grateful to be able to do this interview and collect this history. This history is going to be preserved on DVDs. You'll get a copy of that. The school gets a copy. The Library of Congress gets a copy. So, you know, you're going to be available online for researchers to get to your information and learn things about the war. So, to get started though, I need your birth date and the place of your birth.
June 6, 1923, 6623, at Potter. Well, I was born on a farm at home near Potter, P-O-T-T-E-R, Kansas, which is near Leavenworth. And it was on a farm, and my parents were farmers. They sort of inherited the farm from my grandpa, who lived up at Wathena, Kansas. Grandpa Andrew Miller was a real entrepreneur. He had 12 or 13 kids, and he managed during World War I, to acquire enough wealth and enough farms to give each kid a farm. And he gave mother a farm, and that meant daddy got a farm. And they stayed on it 4 years before they were foreclosed on again. So they left and took me and my younger brother, Bernard, to Oregon and Washington, where they sort of were crop pickers. They picked hops, they picked apples, and they did some ranch work on the way there and after the crop picking. But I don't remember much of that. I remember something, probably what they told me, about a photograph with a goat standing up on a rock, a wild goat, mountain goat, and me down below crying. I was scared. But that's really something I didn't really remember, because they told me about it so much. Then they went down the coast to, they skipped Hollywood. I don't know why they did that. But they went down the coast to Phoenix. And they stopped in Phoenix, and Daddy started doing laboring work, carpentering work, and eventually he became a cement contractor and was working in the construction industry in Phoenix. He bought us a lot out in the desert, which was 6 miles out from St. Mary's School, which was the center of town. And 5.5 miles of that was desert in those days. Can you believe that?
Wow.
Knowing what Phoenix has done since. Just unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, I went to school in Phoenix at St. Mary's 3 years up to my 3rd grade. And at that point in time, Daddy's cement business was in stasis. The economy had stopped, as you know, and buildings stopped. I remember the houses that he was working on. One was the foundation, one was a little bit of the studs, One had maybe some of the roof on. One was almost finished, but they didn't move anymore. They just sat there. And he sold his, or gave his equipment away. He had big cement mixers. He gave our equipment away, and we packed up in our new Oldsmobile, our 1928 Oldsmobile, which he had purchased while things were good. And we had a big trunk on the back, and he made a little two-wheel trailer. We packed up all our goods from our desert lot, which had a garage and a lean-to where we lived. He never did get finished the house. We packed it up and went back to Kansas. And we stayed with Grandpa and Grandma Miller for a while, and then took another mortgaged farm out at close to Huron, Kansas, which is about 40 miles from St. Joe, say 40 miles from Wathena. Out west, which meant where the dry area starts, where the drought began to have its effect. And 1932 was the last good farm year in Kansas, except along the Missouri River, where people could still grow crops if they had some bottom land. We went through 3, 4 more years, each year, worse, drought. I guess in 1933, had a sort of half crop, and the corn burned up. In the middle of June, hot winds came by, and the corn burned up. I spent that summer, fall, with a sled with a knife on the side of it, cutting the corn with a horse pulling the sled, cutting the corn and shocking it up, and we ground it up and used it for feed in the wintertime. But farming was no good because of the drought. Daddy bought a combine, a big Gleaner Baldwin, 12-foot Baldwin combine, and he went around cutting wheat for people who had a little bit. And he did that 2 years. He bought a new Massey Harris tractor, 4-wheel drive. I don't know whether you've ever seen a picture of a 4-wheel drive Massey Harris, but it looks like a big spider to pull the combine. And then that was no good. So he had a farm sale, like usual. In the meantime, I was going to school. My brother and Bernard and I were going to school at St. Mary's over at Purcell, which was 4 miles, and we used to walk all the time. And then just before we left, I started school at Huron. I was in the 7th grade by then, and never finished that year at Huron, but we went to Wamego, which is closer to Manhattan, Kansas, and ran a grocery store, an IGA store. It was a joke, Ignorant Grocers Association store, because we were not storekeepers, and it was a depression, and the store had been sold because it wasn't economical anyway. And we stayed there most of the summer and fall and winter. Then he sold it, went to Atchison, Kansas, where the most important experience was an ice storm which put about 6 inches of clear ice on everything. And we used to have a lot of fun sliding downhill on cardboard. I was at a nun school there for about 3 months maybe. Then we moved up to Grandpa's farm. Grandpa had retired, and his son Leo had taken it over, and Leo and Daddy were partners. And so that spring and that summer, I worked with Daddy and Leo on the farm, including some bottomland where we could really raise corn yet. But I don't know, Daddy didn't get along. So we left. we went to Oregon. By that time, there were several more of us. I think Lawrence and Betty Grace had come along, but there was still to come Marvin and Glenn and Charlotte. They didn't come along right away. Eventually, we were 10, but that's because we had twins, one set of twins. That only means 9 hospital visits, except if we didn't go to hospitals. They were all born at home, all of us. Went to Oregon, and Bernard and I picked hops and apples in Washington, Oregon. And then Daddy bought a little herb farm, a vegetable farm, down close to Salem. And we spent a year there, but if you know Oregon and the Willamette Valley, you know that it rains all winter long. And Daddy was working as a carpenter in town, and I was doing the farming, and Bernard was still going to school. I had finally graduated from number 11 out by Grandpa's place. I had gone to school 2 months, and an 18-year-old girl, a high school graduate with education courses, coached me enough so that I and my cousin graduated and passed the county exams. They talk about the tax exams down here. We had exams too, and I passed, and I was in the upper 10th quartile. So I was big. I was good. And I learned it all from that teacher in 2 months. We went to Salem. I jumped backward a little bit. And I did the vegetable farming, and I sold vegetables on the highway. President Roosevelt came by one time. We all waved. I love President Roosevelt. He was the one who saved us in 1932, or at least that's the way I remember it. And then Daddy, working outdoors in the wintertime with all the rain, got pneumonia, and he nearly died. And he was so dominant that he would not let us, Mother and me, take him to the hospital or get a doctor. And finally we used mustard plasters and other stuff, and finally brought him around. But that was the end of Oregon. We went back to Kansas. Did you want to know all this?
Certainly.
Went back to Kansas then, and we puttered around. He and I did a lot of different kinds of things, digging wells, roofing houses, painting, and finally got a combine and did a lot of wheat cutting. And we shucked corn by hand back in the good old days, before hybrid corn, by the way. Pre-hybrid corn was 10 feet tall, and the ears were that long, and it took both arms to break the shuck. And so I crow about my corn shucking days too. We started farming on one of the islands in the Missouri River, the low bottoms, and Bernard and I batched on the island, and raised corn and wheat, except it seemed like every summer got flooded out again, or at least most of it did. We did raise some corn and some wheat, but things weren't going along too great. Daddy was getting a little better off. He wasn't quite as poverty-stricken anymore. He was working, and he was doing this and that. And then World War II came along, or at least Pearl Harbor came along. And Daddy and I were in a boat rowing out across the farm of the island. It was about 5 feet of water on it. Missouri River does get high. And he said to me, and I said to him, let's go to St. Joe and get a job at the foundry. So we gave up the farm. I still did some hay work before I got to the foundry that summer, but I did get to the foundry. Daddy and I both went, and we apprenticed ourselves as welders, except welding was not pipe welding. It was pretty hack work, where the foundry would set up these sand molds and pour metal into them, and then there was always some cleaning that had to be done, and you had to chip holes out where the sand holes were filled up, and then you weld stuff back into the holes. Mm-hmm. So we were doing that kind of workaday welding, and Daddy quit and went back to the town where we had finally got another house, and we were living on a little farm there. And he started a blacksmith shop, and I stayed at the foundry for 2 more years. And then when I became 20 years old, I quit my job, and next day I had a draft notice. They didn't let any 20-year-olds get away with that. Anyhow, I'd been feeling pretty bad because if I walk the streets of St. Joe, people are always looking at me. So I got drafted. I went down to Leavenworth where they told me to. And that day I was there. I did through the physicals. I did the physicals and went to sleep that night. Next morning had breakfast, and the bacon was raw. The coffee was weak. The toast was burnt. It was the sloppiest breakfast I'd ever seen. Even though I'd gone through the Depression, I'd never seen food that badly prepared or presented. And that day I heard that there was going to be a special group of 6 men allowed to get in the Navy at the Army base. That's sort of unusual. But there was also 2 Marines, but they'd been taken. I didn't get the Marines. I would have taken them. Just dumb enough to join the Marines. That was before I knew what Marines did. I have a younger brother who wanted to join the Marines. And my brother and I both said, don't do it. And he was wrong. I don't know what they did to him, but something happened to his head. I went into the Navy, and my cousin who was with me that day, he stayed in the Army. And he spent the war out in West Texas, out close to Lubbock, a dusty Army camp, driving a truck. And I went to the Navy to Kansas City, the long southern route to San Francisco, to Treasure Island, and 2 weeks of boot camp at Treasure Island. And then they whisked me up to the harbor entrance control post up by the Golden Gate on Fort Scott to the underground radio station. So I became a member of the radio station. I could have become a signalman, you know, the kind that wave flags, but I chose radio. I went into the radio station in the middle of the night, and the supervisor of the watch said, here's a typing book, there's a typewriter, learn to type. So I did. And I spent my year there with, you know, with a lot of pleasure. I had a cousin, a lady cousin who ran a beauty shop, and she used to take me to dinner and take me to movies and take me to opera. She tried her best to educate this country kid, and I think it helped a whole lot. I was there about a year until I learned to collect Morse code, 5-letter groups at 15 words a minute. I could type 45, 50 words a minute, and I knew how to run the office, the radio room. We had teletypes, we had voice radios, we communicated with the incoming patrol boats, the ones that let down the submarine net under the Golden Gate Bridge, which I could see any morning I looked out there. It wasn't too foggy. And it was real pleasant. You know, it wasn't like being on the battlefield. And that's where I was until they sent me to Terminal Island down by, well, Los Angeles County, LA County. Terminal Island is just off the beach there somewhere. I'm trying to think of a name, I can't right now. And we waited for our ship. We used to stand guard on our ship. They were still building it. But they got done with that in several months, and we went out and did our cruising up down the coast, shakedown, in storms. Captain Stewart loved to take us out in a storm. And he really shook us down too. But we did all the things that we're supposed to do in a shakedown, like shoot at targets and stuff. And finally, it was necessary to go away, and we went straight to New Guinea, Hollandia. Except that there was a stop or two on the way because Captain Stewart was a coward. And the aerial radar wasn't working. And the officer, a civilian engineer in charge of the radar, Big Belly, couldn't fix it. And Captain Stewart locked him up in his room. And the young first-class radioman, radio technician, he fixed it. And so we went on to the next place, to Lagi, and for some reason our after engine room wasn't working right. So we had to stop and have it repaired. And I never figured out how Captain Stewart managed to make it unwell. How could he make an engine room not work? So that we had to have repairs on the way to Hollandia. Anyhow, we did, and we didn't get to Hollandia in time to make the first invasions of the Philippines. The first invasions were done just before Christmas, and we got there about Christmas time. So we didn't get to go in over at Subic Bay for the first invasions. We got there for the second, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth, and the seventh, and eighth, carrying troops back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, here, there, and the other place. And I think the internet did indicate that we shot down an airplane, a Jap Kamikaze at Linck Gulf invasion. But we didn't really have much bad action. We were simply with other groups. I mean, with, you know, big groups of ships going in with making landings. We had 16 boats, LCVPs, and we put our troops, we may have been up to 1,000 in on our ship at a time, and put them in those boats and sent them into the beach. Now, I was the lucky guy. I was the boat radioman up on top of the ship in between the two stacks. I could see everything, and I was communicating with the boats. So my battle station was a real nice place to be. If I'd been down in the radio room, I would have been scared shitless, like they were, because they could hear, but they couldn't see. I could see. So that's why I can sometimes go ahead and say that I enjoyed it. It was a great show. Oh, I did this over and over and over and over. And then sometimes we'd be out at Hollandia when it was hotter than hell, and we'd just be sitting there with the ship swaying in the tide, you know, and nothing to do except copy the radio messages, which we would be getting from Australia, not from Hawaii. but from Australia, and usually the static was tearing us up. And I would have to get the complete messages from some of the capital ships, which meant using the flags and getting the messages that we hadn't been able to copy. So we'd get our files complete. Had to get our files complete. And that was sort of embarrassing, but I had to do it. There were other times when it was hot and half the crew would be over the side chipping paint. And what do you do in the heat when you chip paint? You get scalded between your legs and under your arms and in your ears. So most of the crew spent at least part of the morning in the sick bay getting their ears, their arms, their private parts painted blue because of the gall. What do you call it anyway? That's what I call it right now. Galled raw. I got some of that too. I even got it in my ears, although I wasn't chipping paint. Then after a beautiful time at Hollandia, which wasn't too bad, but you know, it was hot down there, and oftentimes just as miserable as could be. One of the things I didn't like about being down there was that we used to have to eat Australian beef. That's mutton. And mutton is interlined with meat and fat and meat and fat and meat and fat, and it's not too delicious. We had to put up with some of that too. Then we got into a convoy and went up to Okinawa. And on the way up to Okinawa, there were, in the convoy, I was up on top of the ship. I could see ahead, I could see back. There'd be kamikazes come out of nowhere and hit a ship ahead or hit somebody behind, or they'd shoot them out of the sky. That could happen. But we didn't get hit. We were real lucky. And I could see submarines sometimes on the way to Okinawa, which seemed like it took a long time, you know, maybe a couple of weeks to get up to Okinawa. And when we did get in the harbor at Okinawa, there were thousands of ships there, big ships, little ships. And they were landing troops on the beach all the time. I think our group went in called the 11th Wave. That's the way I remember it, 11th Wave. And there were LCVPs parked on the beach. I could see them off in the distance. Sometimes some unfortunate American would come zooping up over the bluff and get shot down by the LCVPs. I mean the LSTs. I don't know whether anybody ever reported that. Our boys shooting down our planes. You know, they'd hop up there so quick and they'd get shot down before anybody could stop and think. I could see that going on. And the kamikazes, every day, we would hear on the radio that there are 200, 400 coming down. And some of our fighter pilots would be up, shooting them down, all the way down to Okinawa. But there are always a bunch of them get down, and you could see them in the overcast, come in the overcast, and then they'd start diving. And our capital ships had a lot of firepower. They'd usually blow them out of the air, or maybe big fragments would fall on some ship. We didn't get hit. In fact, I don't think we fired a shot. The big ships were taking care of things. But that went on for 2 weeks. And then one of the bad things that happened to me was that one of our LCVPs was sent on some mission carrying somebody somewhere. And then it got disconnected from the ship. And my best friend and the best Morse code copier was on that boat, and he got transferred. So I lost my best typist, my best Morse code copier. He could sit there asleep and never miss a letter. I never could forget that. He was the best. I wasn't that good. We were sent down to Camaretta. You found that notation somewhere. You had some internet printout. Camaretta. We were down there to supply power to a hospital ship, a Red Cross, great big Red Cross ship, had a Japanese pilot, airplane, and bomb in its stack. And they had to wait for an expert to come and defuse the bomb. Nobody, we didn't have one, they didn't have one. So we were there 2 weeks before the bomb was removed. And I was out on top of my ship all the time, except when I was doing the newspaper at that time too. I was a newspaperman, a journalist. I was also copying the ship's log. I was the captain's toady. Every day I went back to my after radio room, fantail, where I did the newspaper, and I would see the corpsman out there on the fantail checking bodies, checking the dog tags, recording the dog tags. The bodies they would be brought in every day from somewhere out where the minesweepers had been, where the Japs had dive bombed and disabled the minesweeps. And the boys were floating in the water in their K-pox, and they were machine gunned in the water. And our people would come out, salvage them, bring them in to our ship, and check the dog tags, record them every day, and put them in big weighted sacks and take them back out to sea for burial. Did you know that they buried people at sea instead of bringing them home? I read things, sometimes they brought bodies home, but they didn't bring all the bodies home. And that went on for 2 weeks, and then finally the bomb was removed and we were sent. The first thing we did was go up to Japan to one of the atomic bomb sites or ports. And myself and another boy went walking where they had bulldozed the ground smooth all over that city. I suppose we were flaming with radiation. And so far as I know, it didn't do anything to me except maybe make me a genius, because I did get my doctorate,
Mm-hmm.
I remember walking some hills where the paths around the hills had bodies sticking out of graves. They'd been buried up there and bones would be sticking out. I also remember that a little couple, a little wizened old couple who had a new plyboard shack, smaller than half of this area right here, as their new home, invited us in to tea. And we didn't know what to do, so we took off our shoes and went in, sat down on the floor, and tried to be nice. Although, actually, I don't know how I could be nice. And they were very nice. They were trying to make it up somehow. But they're the ones that'd been bombed. Well, we went back to the States, and we went back, and then we went forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And finally, most of the boys had gone by then. I was still on the ship. I was chief radioman, really. They had this announcement that maybe we could go to Bikini. So sometime in '46, I decided to stay on the ship and go to Bikini, see what that was all about, which I did. And we went through all the publicity, you know, tidal waves on Honolulu 15 feet high and stuff like that. Got out to the Bikini area and stayed around until they were ready to do the testing. And one of the things that doesn't get mentioned in my book is that there was a prevailing wind, and they had the ships strung out 3 or 4 different strings, and they stayed there until the day that they dropped the bomb. And that night, they all scrambled. You know, they weren't anchored at both ends. So they all just flurried around. And they went ahead and dropped the bomb anyway from the air and missed the target by a quarter mile. And we had observers on my ship. We had VIPs on my ship. We had observers who went out, you know, in scuba diving gear, and there's some pictures in that book, to look at what did get sunk, to look at the remnants underwater. And when they came back that evening, some of them were brought back on stretchers. And we said, oh, they're just scared. I don't think anybody knew what they were doing. We went out for the second one. The first one, we went out 18 miles and watched, and I took pictures, and then the pictures eroded. They evaporated eventually. I wasn't supposed to take pictures, but I took them, and I had sunglasses on. And when the bomb burst, there was a big crash in the radios. And that was really all there was to it. You know, the big static burst. The next trip, we went out only 9 miles, half the distance. And that one was done underwater, so it was in place. And they had tried to straighten up the lines. So maybe they got better tests that way, but I can imagine that first one where they went out, and when all the instruments like that were looking the wrong way, they didn't get much out of that. But they probably did better on the second shot. One of the things that I always remembered for so long was they had a German pocket battleship. It wasn't the Graf Spee, or Spray, whichever. It was the companion. And they blew it up. It was the most beautiful ship. It was streamlined. It was svelte. It was a really top model. You know, a New York model. It was wonderful. And they blew it up. I don't know why. Should have kept it. I wonder if any historians ever regret that. They ought to. Somebody should have been pounded for blowing up that ship. Now you could blow up any number of online ships you wanted to, but that German pocket battleship was beautiful. Well, we went home finally, and I got my discharge. And the last evening I was there, I was with my local girlfriend, and we were talking about getting married. And she was from Iowa, so she was going to come back in the middle of the country too. And then for some reason I went and spent a whole afternoon sitting in a local civil court watching the judge dismiss people for all kinds of petty crimes. I don't know why I did that, but I think it must have had something to do with my head later. I went back home, on ship, on a train. It was my second or third train ride by then. And got into St. Joe, Missouri at midnight. And my folks were there. They picked me up and carried me out 40 miles out to where the new farm was, out at Purcell. And went to Mass the next morning. And Monday morning I went down to St. Benedict's and signed up for college because I had gotten my GED certificate while I was on the ship. There was a young officer from Bowdoin College named David Bowdoin who talked me into taking those courses and passing those tests, and I got my GED before I left the ship. And I often wondered what happened to David, a young officer who was just being real nice, real helpful. They said when Captain Stewart got off the ship, one of our officers, I think it was the one who in charge of all the merchandise, all the stuff, went with him to a bar and beat him up. I always appreciated that. I hope it happened. You know, the Library of Congress probably doesn't need to know all this stuff, but Captain Stewart deserved it. He had been mean to so many officers. When we went down across the equator, became, what's that society where you have, you know, my head's not working, where you have an initiation for crossing the equator. Captain Stewart took one of the young officers, also a C division officer, radio division officer, that he didn't like, but nobody else liked him either. They said he was stinky. He didn't take a bath. I, on one occasion, became very acquainted with him, very friendly with him. He and I had both been beaten up in Portland at a bar fight, and so we became buddies. But anyhow, he made that officer suffer. He hosed him down the passageways. He put him up in a yard's arm to look for Davy Crockett. Not Davy Crockett. Who is it? Davy somebody. He mistreated him awfully. He had him locked in his room. He wouldn't give him his promotion, which was automatic. Where'd I get off on this? Anyhow, there was one officer that I liked that the captain didn't like and treated him horribly. And I was glad that the captain got beat up after he left the ship. I'm sure that the U.S. Navy wants to know that. I went to St. Benedict's in Atchison, Kansas for 3 months, and then I had what called terminal leave. I had 3 months of terminal leave because I went to Bikini. And then I went up to Great Lakes to get my discharge or reenlist. And I was really going to reenlist because I wasn't doing so good at school. But when I got there, they claimed that I had gotten there an hour late, and I think it was something to do with the railroad time. And they wanted to take the weekend off. They'd been working steadily for a long time. And they locked me up on base, and I got so pissed off I would not re-enlist. Luckily, I had my Spanish book with me, which I sort of enjoyed, and I studied Spanish. When I got back to school, because that's where I went, I didn't stay in the Navy. I might have been chief radioman. You know, that'd been great. A lot of money there. I got an A in 6 hours of Spanish. And that put me on the honor roll. And I've never been off the honor roll. I got stuck. I got my bachelor's degree, magna cum laude. I got a good degree, a master's degree down at Kansas State, Manhattan. I got a good PhD at the University of Kansas after a long time. I had to go to England in order to get my stuff for my dissertation. And then I took a job at Commerce, Texas, which is here. My wife, at that time, I had married a Dallas girl. We were both at Kansas, working on our doctorates. Had been there 6 years, and the head of the department said it was about time that we go away and let somebody else in, which we did. I came down here. Paul Barris, who was head of the English department here, gave me more money than anyone else would offer, so I came here. He did that because I was a Roman Catholic. I don't know whether your archives will hold all that, but he wanted someone to run the Newman Club. So I came here. My mother-in-law told me not to, because at the end of 7 years of drought, Commerce didn't look very green. It looked awful. But I went to England and got my stuff for my dissertation. My wife had gotten hers in the meantime. And we were all set to live our lives here, but she didn't want to live here, so we got a divorce. And I stayed on, and on, and on. And I retired in 1991, and I'm still here in 2007. Can you believe that?
I can believe that.
I think that's about the end of my story. You let me tell the whole damn thing.
You did good.
Well, good.
Well,
I hope I'm not embarrassed when I look at that.
I don't think you will be. Now I'm going to backflash a little bit and ask you some questions I normally ask some veterans that.
How much did I mess you up?
No, you didn't. You didn't mess that up. But in backflashing a little bit, can you recall the day or the place or the circumstances that you heard about Pearl Harbor?
I can. We were on a farm 8 miles out from the highway, 8 miles from Wathena, another direction, on mud roads. Mother and Daddy had gone to town to get groceries, I guess, and I and the kids were out on the farm. I mean, at least we were on the farm site. We weren't doing any farming there, but we were there. That was our headquarters for working Daddy and me.
Mm-hmm.
And the folks came home and said that there had been this big bombing thing in Pearl Harbor. And so they're the ones who told me. Now, one of my brothers says that they had a radio, a battery-operated radio, which he remembers hearing it from, but I must not have been at the house. I don't remember that at all. It was Mother and Daddy coming home from town that told us that there had been this thing, Pearl Harbor thing. And it wasn't until next day that we got the Atchison Daily Globe. Remember that? Atchison Daily Globe was a famous newspaper, and one of my favorite newspapers of all time. Had the news. It had to be delivered by mail next day, you know.
Now, do you feel like, or do you recall that most of the people your age, when they heard about Pearl Harbor, did that signal to you that America was in war and that most of the young men would be going to war?
No. Isolated out on the farm, I didn't have anybody to talk to. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I ever heard anything like that. I don't think anybody really understood what we involved. Mm-hmm. We just knew this was a terrible thing and something had to be done about it. We heard about Franklin Delano Roosevelt saying It was a day of infamy and something had to be done about it. But I don't think any of us, my age at least, I hadn't gone to high school. So I didn't have any buddies in my age at that time. I had to quit high school and work. And so I didn't really have anybody to confer with. Actually, I was an isolated farmer.
See, that's good. That's good information, because when we compare, or researchers compare someday how it affected you versus how it affected some other veterans, because of your circumstances, it wasn't a big thing in your life at that time anyway. Where other veterans said, "Oh, we knew, we'd all be going." So it's an interesting contrast. Now, before Pearl Harbor, did you, your family, hear much of the war going on in Europe and around the world and Japan? And did you ever hear much about any of that?
Well, I can tell you that when I was going to school at Huron, that was earlier, I was in the 6th grade, we had a little feisty man teacher in the big room named Gilkerson, and he had been a reserve army man or something, an officer, before he started teaching. And he told us when Germany moved into the, I can't even think of the word, that valley area, what's that called? When Germany moved in there, he said, "We are going to have a war." But that was in '36, I think. And I heard that, I heard him say that, and I thought that's interesting. And in fact, one time in Phoenix, when Daddy was selling his equipment to a rather rich man, I guess, who had a whole bunch of guns in his office, he said, "In about 10 years, I guess we'll have a little war for you." I remember that. But that wasn't Pearl Harbor. That was before people heard of Pearl Harbor. And so Gilkerson said we were going to have a war. But I was in the 6th grade.
Yeah. Wasn't very meaningful to you at that point, was it?
No, it didn't seem necessary to do anything about it. Although Germany was apparently getting out of hand.
Now, when you were in the service and the atomic bomb was dropped, where were you at that time? On Japan.
I don't think I know. I think I might have been down on the island farming that wetland and incommunicado for weeks at a time, batching down here. I learned about it afterwards, soon enough afterwards, but I don't know that I heard about it right away.
Well,
now wait a minute.
Do you think most people...
You're getting me confused.
Oh, that's all right.
I was I was on the way to Okinawa when the bomb was dropped.
Okay.
When the first bomb was dropped.
Right.
That's why I'm confused,
That's okay. That's okay.
I'm blanked out. I was on the ship. Well, darn it, I'm going to have to revise my story. I was on the ship. I had copied the message on the radio news and published it in my paper.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't I remember that?
That's okay.
Published it in my paper, distributed among the officers, the ones who were educated.
Right.
And no one understood what it was all about at all.
That was my next question. Did that signal to you and the other people you were with in the service that, oh, this is the end of the war?
I'm embarrassed.
No, don't be. Don't be.
For some reason, thinking it was some other time and place. Our officers immediately thought that we were going to live through the Okinawa invasion because of the bomb. That's what we thought.
Mm-hmm.
we immediately thought, we're saved. This bomb apparently was so big that it saved us from what we really realized was likely to be doom when we got to Okinawa. Now, I think I'm acquiring Alzheimer's.
Oh, you're doing fine. You're doing fine.
But that blanked out spot there, that's terrible.
Well, that's all right.
But, you know, I was on that ship. I was the one who did the publishing it at first. Nobody else knew about it until I put it in my paper. And it was, you know, something that was going to save us. Oh, I've never been opposed to the bomb because of that. And I think Alzheimer's just got me for a bit.
Well, now, you don't need to be embarrassed at all, because these things happened a long time ago, and it's important that we do know what history we can know from it. And you're doing good. You're doing good. So when you finally got out of the military and you went to college, and then, I mean, I think you did a great thing. You stayed in school and you worked hard and ended up with earning a doctor's degree. I mean, that's, how many veterans did that? I bet not very many, not very many.
I know for my first semester in Atchison, there was an older man who was a veteran staying in the same house with me, and he was a kind of joker and a ne'er-do-well, and he flipped out. I often wondered what happened to him. He just, you know, he went to school and then quit. And I wondered what happened to him. He did not seem very sincere about what he was up to. I would have maybe gone back in the Navy if it hadn't been for the Navy incarcerating me that weekend. Boy, that made me mad.
Now, isn't that interesting? 1 hour late, that weekend, and what happened that weekend changed your life. You ended up getting a doctor's degree. If you'd gone on into the Navy, what would have happened? See, you don't know, but you came here to, what was the name of the school when you came here that many years ago?
East Texas State College.
Okay. And you came to teach and work in English?
English department.
Yeah.
Yeah, at Kansas, we had a really good instructor. We had all these interns working on their doctorates, you know, and they were teaching freshman classes and stuff up there. And we had an intern director who taught us everything we needed to know about how to teach freshman and sophomore composition and stuff. And so actually I had him as my sponsor when I came here. I got good letters from him. So yes, I came here to teach composition, which I've regretted ever since.
So how many years were you here? I forget.
31. I say 33, but they say 31.
Yeah. And you know, of course, all that time you worked with the English department teaching one type of.
Yeah. Well, you know, when I first came here, I was all but. I didn't have my doctorate. It took me a couple more years to get it after I went to England and got back home and wrote my dissertation. But from then on, I was involved in something which happened almost immediately after I got back to school here, our doctoral program. Our doctoral program, I don't know whether you know what that amounts to, but meant all those big graduate courses which I wanted to teach. And did get to teach all through the years.
Well, it's a great honor today to get to talk to someone like you that has been at this school as a professor that many years, and you contributed so much to the school, and you contributed so much to the country, and I really appreciate getting to talk with you and visit with you.
I'm obliged.
Well, thank you.
I love it. I'm glad you did it.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I did it too.